The Strange Murder. It was a quiet September evening in Houston, Texas, when the tranquility of the suburban neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunfire. The year was 1985, and the victim was 50-year-old Greg Wallace, a man known for his quiet demeanor and unassuming lifestyle. When police arrived at the scene, they found Greg lying lifeless in his living room, a single gunshot wound to his chest. The house showed signs of a struggle, a shattered vase, an overturned chair, and a trail of blood leading to the kitchen. At first glance, it seemed like a burglary gone horribly wrong. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime. The truth was far more chilling. The first person detectives questioned was Greg's wife, 43-year-old Linda Wallace. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she recounted the events of that fateful night. "I was in the bedroom when I heard a loud noise," she said, her voice quivering. "I thought it was Greg dropping something, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard him scream, and I ran to the living room. That's when I saw him, lying there bleeding." Her eyes welled up with tears as she spoke, but something about her story didn't sit right with the investigators. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator with a knack for spotting inconsistencies, leaned forward in his chair. "Linda, can you walk us through what happened next? Did you see anyone else in the house?" Linda hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if searching for the right words. I think I saw someone running out the back door. It all happened so fast. I was in shock. I just wanted to help Greg, but he was already gone." Detective Harris exchanged a glance with his partner, Detective Martinez. There was something off about Linda's account. For one, the back door was found locked from the inside, making it impossible for an intruder to escape that way. Secondly, the timeline didn't add up. If Linda had heard the gunshot and rushed to the living room, why hadn't she called 911 immediately? Instead, the call came nearly 20 minutes later from a neighbor who had heard the commotion. As the detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a web of lies and deceit. Linda's story began to unravel under scrutiny. When asked about her relationship with Greg, she claimed they were happily married. But friends and family painted a different picture. They were always fighting. One neighbor confided, "I'd hear them yelling at each other late at night." It wasn't a happy marriage. Another red flag was Linda's financial situation. Greg had recently taken out a large life insurance policy, with Linda as the sole beneficiary. When detectives confronted her about it, she became defensive. "Greg wanted to make sure I was taken care of if anything happened to him," she insisted. "It's not like I asked for it." But the most damning evidence came from the crime scene itself. The gun used to kill Greg was found in the couple's bedroom, wiped clean of fingerprints. However, forensic analysis revealed traces of gunshot residue on Linda's hands. When confronted with this evidence, Linda's demeanor shifted. Her tears dried up, and her voice grew cold. "I didn't kill him," she said, her tone defiant. "You're trying to frame me?" Detective Harris wasn't convinced. "Linda, the evidence doesn't lie. You had motive, opportunity, and means. The gun was in your house, and you had gunshot residue on your hands. How do you explain that?" Linda's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like she might break. But instead, she doubled down. "I don't have to explain anything to you. I love Greg. I would never hurt him." As the investigation continued, more details emerged that pointed to Linda's guilt. A witness came forward, claiming they had seen Linda arguing with Greg in the days leading up to the murder. Another revealed that Linda had been having an affair with a local handyman, adding a potential motive to the mix. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and they all pointed to one conclusion: Linda Wallace had killed her husband. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with reporters flocking to the courthouse to catch a glimpse of the accused. Linda maintained her innocence throughout, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. In the end, the jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even as the gavel fell, questions lingered. Why had Linda done it? Was it for the insurance money? Was it because of the affair? Or was there something darker at play? The truth may never be fully known, but one thing is certain. The murder of Greg Wallace was no random act of violence. It was a calculated crime, born out of greed, betrayal, and a desire to escape a troubled marriage. As the years passed, the case faded from the headlines, but it remains a haunting reminder of the secrets that can lurk behind closed doors. For those who knew Greg, his death was a tragic loss. For Linda, it was the end of a life built on lies. And for the detectives who worked tirelessly to bring her to justice, it was a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones we least expect. The story Linda Wallace told investigators was nothing short of unbelievable. It was a tale so bizarre, so riddled with inconsistencies, that it left even the most seasoned detectives scratching their heads. 10 days before her husband's murder, Linda claimed she had been the victim of a horrifying crime herself. She described being carjacked by a barefoot man wielding a knife, who then allegedly raped her. But here's the twist. She never reported the incident to the police. When asked why, Linda's explanation was as perplexing as the story itself. Greg was recovering from surgery and a recent heart attack, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to upset him. He was already under so much stress. I thought I could handle it on my own. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. Let me get this straight, he said, his tone skeptical. You were carjacked, assaulted, and raped by a stranger, and you decided not to report it because you didn't want to upset your husband? Linda, that doesn't make sense. Most people would go straight to the police, especially after something so traumatic. Linda's eyes filled with tears, but there was a flicker of something else, defensiveness, perhaps even anger. You don't understand, she snapped. Greg was fragile. The doctors said he couldn't handle any more stress. I was trying to protect him. Detective Martinez, who had been quietly taking notes, chimed in. Linda, if this man attacked you once, he could do it again. By not reporting it, you put yourself and possibly Greg at risk. Why didn't you at least tell someone? A friend? A family member? Linda hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't want anyone to know, she whispered. I was ashamed. The detectives exchanged a glance. Her story was full of holes, but they decided to press on. All right, Detective Harris said, leaning forward again. Tell us about the night Greg was killed. What happened? Linda took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It was late, around midnight, she began. Greg was asleep in the bedroom, and I was in the living room watching TV. Suddenly, I heard a noise at the back door. Before I could react, the same man, the one who attacked me before, burst into the house. He was barefoot again, and he had a knife. He grabbed me, tied me up, and he tortured me? Detective Martinez raised an eyebrow. Tortured you? How? Linda's voice quivered as she continued. He cut me. On my arms, my legs. He said he was going to kill me, but then he changed his mind. He went into the bedroom, took the gun from under my pillow, and shot Greg while he was sleeping. I managed to free myself, grabbed another gun, and fired 2 shots at him as he ran out the door. But I missed. Detective Harris frowned. Wait a minute. You had a gun under your pillow? Why? Linda's eyes widened, as if she hadn't expected the question. I was scared, she stammered. After the first attack, I didn't feel safe. I thought having a gun nearby would protect me. But you didn't call the police after the first attack, Detective Harris pointed out. And you didn't call them after this one either. Instead, you fired shots at a fleeing suspect, missed, and then waited for your neighbor to call 911. Linda, none of this adds up. Linda's face flushed with anger. I was in shock, she shouted. My husband was dead and I was bleeding. What was I supposed to do? The detectives weren't buying it. The more Linda talked, the more her story fell apart. For one, there was no evidence of forced entry at the back door. The locks were intact, and there were no signs of a struggle in the living room. Secondly, the gun used to kill Greg was found in the bedroom, wiped clean of fingerprints. If an intruder had taken it, why would he bother to wipe it down? And why would he leave it behind? Then there was the matter of Linda's injuries. While she did have cuts on her arms and legs, they were superficial, nothing that would suggest a prolonged torture session. And the gunshot residue on her hands? That was the final nail in the coffin. If Linda had fired 2 shots at the intruder, why was there residue on both hands? And why was there no evidence of a second gun being fired in the house? As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Linda's story was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to cover up her own involvement in Greg's murder. The detectives theorized that Linda had staged the crime scene to make it look like a burglary gone wrong, but her plan was riddled with mistakes. The inconsistencies in her story, the lack of evidence supporting her claims, and her suspicious behavior all pointed to one conclusion: Linda Wallace was lying. During the trial, the prosecution painted a damning picture of Linda as a cold, calculating killer. They argued that she had murdered Greg for the life insurance money and then concocted an elaborate story to throw off investigators. The jury agreed, and Linda was found guilty of first-degree murder. But even as the verdict was read, questions lingered. Why had Linda gone to such lengths to create an alibi? Was she truly capable of such a heinous crime? Or was there more to the story? Some speculated that Linda's affair with the local handyman played a role in the murder, while others believed she was simply driven by greed. Whatever the motive, one thing was certain: Linda's unbelievable story had unraveled under the weight of the evidence, revealing a truth far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the years passed, the case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. For Linda Wallace, the truth was a prison she could never escape. And for those who knew Greg, his death remained a tragic mystery, a life cut short by the very person who had vowed to love and protect him. Linda sat across from the detectives, her fingers twisting a tissue into shreds. The dim lighting of the interrogation room cast shadows under her tired eyes. Her voice was shaky, but firm as she recalled the traumatic event. He was white, she said at first, her gaze darting between the 2 officers. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a hoodie. I didn't see much of his face, but I know he was white. Detective Harris leaned forward, jotting notes in his worn leather notebook. Are you sure about that, Linda? Any distinguishing features? A scar? A tattoo? Anything that stood out? Linda hesitated. Her hand stilled for just a moment before she shook her head. No. Just his voice. He sounded, she swallowed, angry. Like he hated me? Detective Williams, standing near the door with arms crossed, exchanged a glance with Harris. All right, he said slowly. Let's go over this one more time. You were at the gas station alone when he forced you into your car. He had a knife, right? Linda nodded quickly. Yes. A big one. I thought. She stopped herself, tears welling in her eyes. I thought I was going to die. The detectives remained silent for a moment, allowing her words to settle in the air. Then, Harris flipped back a page in his notes. Linda, he said gently, we need to be sure. In your first statement you said he was white. But now... He glanced at Williams, who finished the thought. Now you're saying he was black. A heavy silence filled the room. Linda inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. I don't know what I said before. It was dark and I was scared. Maybe I got it wrong. Williams exhaled through his nose, an almost imperceptible sign of frustration. Linda, this is serious. If we're going to find the man who did this, we need to be certain. I am certain, she shot back, voice trembling with frustration. She stopped abruptly, biting her lip as if realizing she had misspoken. Harris tapped his pen against the table. Linda, we're just trying to understand. Why the sudden change? She stared at the tabletop, her face unreadable. Then, in barely a whisper, she muttered, "I didn't want people to think I slept with a black man." A heavy silence fell over the room. Williams let out a slow breath and shook his head. Harris, to his credit, kept his expression neutral. "So let me get this straight," Williams said after a moment. "You changed your statement because you were worried about how it would look?" Linda flinched at the bluntness of his words, but didn't deny them. "I didn't think it would matter. I was afraid people would judge me." Harris closed his notebook, setting his pen down carefully on top. "Linda, this is a criminal investigation. We're not talking about gossip or rumors. We're talking about a dangerous man who, according to your statement, broke into your car, took you to your home." And he exhaled, choosing his next words carefully. "What you say dictates where we look, who we interrogate, and how we build our case. Every inconsistency makes it harder for us to find the truth." Linda buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do." William's expression hardened. "Linda, you do realize how serious this is, right? You understand how much credibility you lose when you change your story like this." She nodded wordlessly. Harris exchanged another glance with Williams before sighing. "All right, let's take a step back. You say the attacker forced you into your car at the gas station. But there's something else that doesn't add up. How did he know where you lived?" Linda looked up startled. "What?" "You said he was a carjacker," Williams explained. "A random attack. So how did he know to take you home? Most attackers would dump the victim somewhere else, get rid of the car, disappear. But he drove you straight to your house. How did he know where you lived, Linda?" Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Harris leaned in. "Did you know him?" "No," she blurted out too quickly. "I mean, I don't think so. Maybe he followed me before. Maybe he saw my address somewhere." Williams narrowed his eyes. "Linda, we checked the gas station footage. No one approached your car." Linda paled. That's impossible. He was there, I swear." Harris sighed. "Linda, if you're not telling us the whole truth, now is the time to fix that. Because right now we have too many questions and not enough answers. And if we can't trust your statement." He let the implication hang in the air. Tears streamed down Linda's face, but the detectives had seen too many cases to be moved by them alone. Williams pushed back from the wall. "We'll be in touch," he said curtly before stepping out of the room. Harris lingered a moment longer. "If there's anything else you need to tell us, now is the time, Linda. Because if we find out later that you lied, it won't be pretty." She didn't answer, only staring blankly at the table as Harris got up and followed his partner out of the room. Outside, Williams turned to Harris and shook his head. "Something's not right." Harris nodded grimly. "Yeah, and I have a feeling we're just getting started." Greg and Linda were not alone that night. The house, though silent in the dead of night, was not empty. Linda's son from a previous marriage, Michael, and his girlfriend, Sarah, were also present. Their presence would prove to be a crucial piece in the tangled web of events that unfolded, adding to the layers of doubt that already surrounded Linda's story. It was just past midnight when the supposed attack took place. According to Linda, a masked intruder had broken into their home, moving stealthily through the shadows, and launching a sudden assault on Greg. But the most puzzling part? Despite being awake at the time, neither Michael nor Sarah saw or heard any signs of a struggle until the gunshot shattered the night's silence. The investigators wasted no time in questioning them. Michael, a lanky young man in his early 20s, sat in the dimly lit kitchen, his hands clasped together on the table. The detective, a middle-aged man with a stern face, leaned forward, watching him carefully. "You were awake when it happened?" the detective asked, voice calm but probing. Michael nodded. "Yeah, I was up. Sarah was too. We were watching TV in my room. Did you hear anything?" A commotion, a struggle, maybe someone moving through the house? Michael hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing like that. Just normal night sounds. Then out of nowhere, we heard the gunshot. The detective's brow furrowed. You're certain? No footsteps? No muffled voices? Michael glanced at Sarah, who sat beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against a sudden chill. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. We would have heard something. This house isn't that big. Sound carries. The contradiction was glaring. Linda had described a violent struggle, a fight between Greg and an unknown assailant. Yet Michael and Sarah, mere rooms away, had heard nothing. No thuds, no crashes, no raised voices, only silence until the gunshot. The detective shifted his attention to Sarah. When you heard the shot, what did you do? She swallowed. I froze for a second. Then Michael ran out of the room. I followed. And what did you see? Michael exhaled sharply, as if replaying the scene in his mind. Greg was on the floor. Linda was standing near him, holding the gun. She looked, I don't know, shocked or scared. But there was no one else. No intruder. The detective tapped his pen against his notepad. Did she say anything? Michael hesitated. She kept saying, he was here. He was just here. Like she was trying to convince herself. Sarah added softly, but we didn't see anyone. And no one ran past us. If there was an intruder, where did he go? That was the question that haunted the case. If an unknown attacker had truly been in the house, how had he managed to slip away undetected? The front door was still locked. The windows were secure. There were no footprints leading away from the scene. It was as if this mysterious figure had vanished into thin air. And then there was Linda. The inconsistencies in her story were piling up fast. First, there was the issue of the non-existent struggle. Now there were two witnesses who directly contradicted her claim that an intruder had been there at all. The more the detective examined the details, the more it seemed like the only people present that night were Linda, Greg, Michael, and Sarah. So, let's go over this again, the detective said, voice tightening. You and Sarah heard nothing until the gunshot. Michael nodded. Right? And when you ran out, Greg was already on the ground. The only person holding the gun was Linda. Another nod. Yes. The detective leaned back, staring at them for a moment before closing his notebook. Thank you both, he said, rising to his feet. That'll be all for now. As he walked away, the weight of their words settled in his mind. Linda's story was crumbling. The supposed intruder was a ghost, a fabrication that simply did not fit with the facts. And the biggest question remained. If there had never been an intruder, then who had truly pulled the trigger? Linda's actions in the aftermath of the murder left many puzzled. Her behavior was not just unusual, it was outright suspicious. As investigators pieced together the events of that fateful night, they found themselves repeatedly circling back to the choices Linda made. If she were truly an innocent bystander, why did she act in ways that seemed to obstruct the investigation rather than aid it? When authorities arrived at the crime scene, Linda seemed oddly composed for someone who had just been through a traumatic event. Shock can manifest in different ways, but what stood out was her immediate insistence on taking a shower. Officers on the scene had explicitly told her not to, warning that doing so could destroy critical forensic evidence. Yet, she ignored their instructions. Was she merely in distress, or was she trying to wash away something incriminating? Detective Harris exchanged a glance with his partner, Detective Monroe. They had seen a wide range of reactions from victims and witnesses before: grief, hysteria, numbness. But this felt off. Linda, we need you to refrain from showering until the forensic team has done a full examination, Monroe had told her firmly. Linda barely hesitated before responding. I just need to clean myself. I can't stand the feeling of. She cut herself off and hurried toward the bathroom, shutting the door behind her. Harris sighed. She's going to do it anyway. And she did. By the time they managed to convince her to come out, it was too late. Any potential traces of DNA, blood splatter, or gunpowder residue that might have been on her skin were gone. It was a crucial loss for the investigation, and it only deepened the detective's doubts. Later that night, Linda was taken to the hospital for an examination. This was routine for someone who had been at the scene of such a violent crime. But just as quickly as she arrived, she left. She didn't stay long enough for doctors to conduct a full assessment, another red flag in the minds of the investigators. Why would she leave so soon? Monroe mused as he reviewed the hospital reports. If she had nothing to hide, why not get a full checkup? Harris tapped his pen against the desk. Maybe she was scared. Or maybe she didn't want them finding something. The unanswered questions continued to pile up. As the investigation progressed, detectives turned to a tool often used to gauge the truthfulness of a suspect's statements, a polygraph test. While not always admissible in court, polygraph results can give investigators insight into a person's credibility. Linda's refusal to take the test did not help her case. When asked if she would be willing to take one, she didn't hesitate before declining. "I don't trust those things," she said flatly. "They're not accurate." Harris leaned forward, trying to read her expression. "Linda, this could help clear you." "I'm not doing it," she said, her voice firm. "I don't have to." Of course, she was right. No one could force her to take a polygraph. But it wasn't just the refusal that concerned investigators. It was the way she refused. There was no fear, no hesitation, no nervousness. Just a cold, calculated response. People who are telling the truth usually want to prove it, Monroe muttered under his breath after she left the room. "Not always," Harris countered. "Some people don't trust the system." Monroe folded his arms. "And some people know they'll fail." As the days passed, these three actions, destroying forensic evidence, leaving the hospital prematurely, and refusing the polygraph test, became the cornerstone of investigators' growing suspicions. They had seen cases like this before, where every small action built a picture of guilt. Was Linda merely acting out of trauma, or was she trying to cover her tracks? The case was becoming murkier by the day, and Linda's behavior wasn't making it any clearer. If anything, it was raising more questions than answers. And in a case where every detail mattered, her actions were impossible to ignore. For decades, the shadow of Greg's murder loomed over the small town, whispering through hushed conversations and unanswered questions. His death was a wound that had never fully healed, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. And at the center of it all was Linda. Despite countless interrogations and ever-growing suspicion, Linda was never charged. The case remained open, lingering in the depths of police files like a ghost that refused to rest. There was no shortage of circumstantial evidence: her shifting alibis, her cold and detached demeanor, the eerie way she spoke about Greg after his death. But without solid proof, the law could not touch her. Investigators, however, were far from giving up. They had spent years watching her, combing through her past, waiting for the one crack that would bring the truth to light. "I know she did it," muttered Detective Ryan Monroe, tapping his fingers restlessly on the side of his coffee cup. He had been working the case for over 15 years, and Linda's name haunted him like an unfinished sentence. His partner, Detective Sarah Wilkes, let out a weary sigh. "We need more than a gut feeling, Ryan. That's all we've ever had, suspicions, inconsistencies, but nothing that holds up in court." Monroe rubbed his tired eyes. "It doesn't add up, Sarah. No forced entry. No sign of a struggle. The way she acted after his death, it wasn't grief. It was relief." Wilkes exhaled sharply. "You're preaching to the choir, but unless we find something solid, she walks free. And she knows it." Linda had built a life beyond the tragedy. To the outside world, she was a composed and graceful woman, someone who had endured loss and moved on. But to those who knew the details, there was something unsettling about her. She never spoke about Greg's murder unless directly asked, and even then, her answers were rehearsed, carefully measured. There was no sorrow in her voice, no yearning for justice. Only distance. She's clever, Monroe admitted, staring at an old crime scene photo. Too damn clever. Meanwhile, Linda carried on with her life, as if the past had no hold on her. Yet, she was not oblivious to the eyes that followed her every move. She knew they were waiting for her to slip, to confess, to show a flicker of guilt. But she never would. One evening, as she poured herself a glass of wine in the dim glow of her kitchen, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Hesitating only for a moment, she picked up. Linda. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate. Her fingers tightened around the glass. Who is this? A pause. Then, do you ever think about him? Her pulse quickened. Excuse me? Greg, the voice said. Do you ever think about the night he died? She swallowed, forcing herself to remain composed. I think about it all the time, she replied smoothly. Losing him was devastating. A soft chuckle. Is that what it was? Devastation? Linda's hand trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. I don't know what game you're playing, but I suggest you stop wasting my time. I think you do know, and I think your time is finally running out. The line went dead. Linda stood frozen, the echo of the call lingering in the silence around her. It had been years since anyone had dared to challenge her so boldly. She set the glass down with a sharp clink, her mind racing. Someone knew something, or at least they thought they did. Elsewhere, Detective Monroe smirked as he placed his phone down on his desk. She's rattled, he murmured. Wilkes raised an eyebrow. That was risky. It was necessary. We need to shake the tree a little. Maybe something will finally fall. The years had worn on, but the pursuit of justice had never wavered. Linda might have escaped consequences for decades, but the past had a way of catching up. And this time it would not be ignored. The deeper investigators dug into Linda's past, the more disturbing details surfaced. Her life was a tangled web of deception, greed, and manipulation. Greg wasn't just another unfortunate soul who had fallen for her charm. He was her 8th husband. And, perhaps most shocking of all, when she married him, she was still legally bound to her 7th. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he stared at the documents sprawled across his desk. 8 husbands, he muttered. How the hell does someone get away with that? His partner, Detective Morales, let out a low whistle. Not just that, she said, flipping through the files. She was still legally married to number 7 when she tied the knot with Greg. That's bigamy. Harris let out a heavy sigh. That's not even the worst part. Look at this. He pointed to a page filled with financial statements. She drained $4,000 from her last husband's account before vanishing into thin air. Morales frowned, shaking her head. Let me guess, he never saw a penny of it again. Bingo. The pattern was becoming clear. Linda had a habit of luring men in, bleeding them dry, and then moving on when she had gotten what she wanted. But with Greg, things had taken an even darker turn. She was the sole beneficiary of his estate, Harris continued. Life insurance policy, assets everything. And wouldn't you know it, the payout was significant. Morales leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. That's a hell of a motive. Exactly. This wasn't just a woman who couldn't hold down a marriage. This was someone who saw relationships as financial opportunities. And when Greg became more valuable to her dead than alive, she didn't hesitate. The detectives exchanged a knowing glance. The case was beginning to take a shape they had seen before, a classic case of a black widow. The kind of woman who lured men into her web with promises of love and devotion, only to leave destruction in her wake. As they pieced together more of Linda's past, they tracked down her former husbands. Some were hesitant to talk, ashamed of how easily they had been fooled. Others were angry, their voices laced with bitterness and regret. I should have seen it coming, one of them, Michael, admitted over the phone. She was always secretive about money. She made me take out loans for her, maxed out my credit cards. Then one day, she was just gone. Another, Robert, had a more chilling recollection. She wasn't just a gold digger, he said, his voice tight with emotion. She knew exactly what she was doing. I remember waking up one night to find her just standing over me, watching me sleep. I laughed it off at the time, thought maybe she was having a bad dream. But now I wonder if she was thinking about something else. Morales shuddered as she jotted down notes. This woman isn't just manipulative, she's dangerous. They visited Greg's sister, who had been one of the first to raise concerns about Linda after his death. She sat across from them, wringing her hands, her face pale with grief. I knew something was off about her, she said. Greg was always so kind, so trusting. He thought he had found love again. But Linda, she was different. She isolated him from us. Anytime we tried to reach out, she'd answer his phone and make excuses. Said he was busy, or that he didn't feel like talking. But that wasn't like Greg at all. Harris nodded, scribbling in his notebook. Did he ever mention anything about her past? No, she said. She made sure he only knew what she wanted him to know. And by the time we realized the extent of it, it was too late. The pieces were all coming together. Linda had mastered the art of deception, carefully curating her identity with each new husband, ensuring that no one saw the full picture until it was too late. Morales exhaled sharply. She's a textbook predator. Harris agreed. And Greg wasn't just another victim. He was the one she finally decided to cash in on. As they prepared to bring Linda in for questioning, there was an unspoken understanding between them. This case wasn't just about justice for Greg. It was about stopping a woman who had spent a lifetime getting away with it. But as they would soon learn, Linda wasn't the kind of woman to go down without a fight. Linda's connections to law enforcement seemed to shield her from scrutiny for years, a situation that gave her the illusion of invincibility. It all started with her sons, two of whom became officers in the Houston Police Department. When you've got that kind of familial link to law enforcement, it can be easy to slip under the radar. You could almost hear the whispers around town. Linda's untouchable. She's got the cops in her corner. For those who didn't know her, the idea of someone like Linda, with such deep ties to the very people who were supposed to uphold the law, seemed like an unbreakable shield. Linda wasn't just a bystander in this network either. She too had embedded herself within the folds of the Houston Police Department, but in a less conspicuous way. She held a civilian job within the department, further cementing her influence. If anyone dared question her actions, there was always someone on the inside who could back her up. Or, at least, that's how it appeared on the surface. Linda's role in the department, alongside her sons, created a network of protection that would make anyone pause before challenging her. But, despite these carefully woven connections, the truth about Greg's death eventually surfaced. The layers of protection she had built up over the years began to crumble. There's something unnerving about how small things can sometimes unravel even the tightest of webs. One might wonder, did Linda feel safe enough to believe she could never face the consequences of her actions? Or was she so blinded by her own sense of power that she thought she could control everything, including fate? It's not as if the law enforcement community was oblivious to the tension surrounding Greg's death. People had noticed things. It was the kind of thing you couldn't ignore. The investigation had started, and initially it seemed like it was going nowhere. But then something changed. Maybe it was the courage of those who couldn't stay silent any longer, or maybe it was simply the determination of a prosecutor who was tired of seeing someone get away with murder. The truth about Greg's death, about how it had been swept under the rug for so long, couldn't stay hidden forever. In 2008, prosecutors finally made their move. Despite Linda's connections, despite the apparent immunity she had built for herself within the law enforcement community, the charge of Greg's murder was brought against her. It was a turning point in the case, and one that seemed almost unimaginable just a few years earlier. Imagine for a moment being in Linda's shoes when the walls started closing in. Was she in disbelief? Could she have truly expected her past ties to protect her forever? Perhaps in the quiet moments when she was alone, a seed of doubt began to take root. Or, perhaps not. Maybe she had convinced herself, all along, that she would never have to answer for what she had done. The court proceedings were intense. There was a palpable sense of tension in the air as the prosecution began to piece together the evidence against Linda. It wasn't just about Greg's death. It was about everything Linda had concealed for so many years. The deeper they dug, the more the cracks in her carefully constructed world began to show. One witness, someone from Linda's past, was called to the stand. The air was thick with anticipation. They had been waiting for this moment for anyone, to speak up about the truth. The courtroom fell silent as the witness recalled their experiences with Linda and what they had seen leading up to Greg's murder. "I never thought she was capable of something like this," the witness said, their voice trembling slightly. "But looking back, there were signs. Things didn't add up. I just didn't know what to do." Her connections made it seem like she could never be touched. Linda, sitting in the defendant's chair, appeared calm, but you could see the small flicker of tension in her eyes. She wasn't used to being the one under scrutiny. She wasn't used to being the one who had to explain herself. Her world was crumbling, but she wasn't ready to admit it. Another witness took the stand, this time one of Linda's sons, a Houston police officer. His testimony was equally as revealing, though it was clear that he was torn between loyalty to his mother and his duty to the truth. "I don't want to believe it. She's my mother, you know, but I've seen things that I can't ignore. My mom was involved in something dangerous." It wasn't just about Greg. It was about everything that had happened before. The room was silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The officer's voice cracked as he struggled to come to terms with the reality of his own mother's actions. The man had been trained to serve justice, to protect and to serve. But now, he was confronted with a choice no one should ever have to make, a choice between family loyalty and the law. For the first time, Linda was facing the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just the legal charges she had to contend with. It was the unraveling of everything she had spent years building. Her connections to law enforcement weren't enough to save her. Her carefully curated relationships didn't shield her from the truth. In the end, the very thing she had relied on to protect her became the very thing that exposed her. Prosecutors and investigators, driven by a sense of duty and justice, had finally pierced through the veil of secrecy that had allowed Linda to avoid accountability for so long. It wasn't a story of law enforcement corruption, as some might have feared. It was a story of how even the most powerful connections can't hold back the tide of justice forever. Linda had been able to hide in the shadows, but those shadows were finally fading. The truth was about to come into the light. Would Linda's story be a cautionary tale about the dangers of thinking you're untouchable? Or would it be a grim reminder of the lengths some will go to for power, even at the expense of justice? The courtroom would soon decide. The legal battle that Linda faced was nothing short of a roller coaster. When the charges were first brought against her, she had no doubt that her team of high-powered lawyers would find a way to get her out of this mess. After all, she had connections, money, and influence. Surely, that would be enough to tip the scales in her favor. But what she didn't expect was the fierce determination of the prosecution, which refused to let the case go quietly into the night. Her lawyers immediately set to work, making a bold move early in the process. They fought hard to have the case dismissed, arguing that there simply wasn't enough forensic evidence to bring her to trial. Without a body, without concrete evidence linking Linda to Greg's murder, they reasoned, there was nothing solid to convict her on. To their surprise, the judge sided with the defense team, ruling in favor of dismissal. The courtroom was filled with a palpable sense of relief. Linda exhaled deeply, her eyes bright with a glimmer of hope. She had always believed in her innocence, even though she couldn't quite shake the suspicion that the world might not see her that way. But now, she was one step closer to freedom. Her lawyer, a calm and composed man, spoke up as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. "We've won, Linda. This case is over." Linda let out a breath she hadn't even realized she had been holding. "I told you they didn't have anything on me. We'll walk free now." This whole thing was a waste of time. But not everyone was ready to let the case go. Prosecutors weren't about to back down so easily. From the moment the ruling came in, they knew they had to fight for justice. The decision to dismiss the case may have seemed like a victory, but it wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The prosecution team, determined to make Linda answer for Greg's death, immediately filed an appeal. Linda had been so sure that her connections and influence would be enough to put this whole mess behind her. But the news of the appeal hit her like a punch to the stomach. She couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over her. "They're not letting this go," she muttered under her breath, pacing back and forth in the elegant, dimly lit office of her lawyer. Her lawyer, who had been confident just moments before, was now furrowing his brow. "We'll fight it, Linda. We've got the law on our side. You've got nothing to worry about." But Linda wasn't so sure. She knew the prosecution wouldn't back down easily. They had already shown that they were willing to go the distance, and now the case was going to the appellate court. The weight of it all was beginning to feel suffocating. When the appellate court finally weighed in on the matter in 2012, the decision was a game-changer. The charges against Linda were reinstated. There it was, plain as day. She was going to have to stand trial. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the news spread, and Linda's face drained of color. She was no longer the woman who could walk away unscathed. "Linda," her lawyer said softly, the gravity of the situation evident in his voice, "this isn't over. We're not done yet." Linda, who had been holding her composure for so long, finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her voice was shaky as she spoke. "But we don't have anything solid, right? They're just guessing. There's no evidence. How can they take me to trial on nothing?" Her lawyer hesitated before responding, his gaze hardening. "I know you're scared, but the circumstantial evidence against you is overwhelming. The truth is, Linda, the case is stronger than you think. We can't hide from that forever." The weight of the words seemed to settle around Linda, making her feel small. She had built her life on connections and power, but now, standing in the face of a trial, it was all starting to feel like a crumbling house of cards. She thought back to all the times she had felt untouchable, the moments where she had smiled at the thought that no one would ever dare question her actions. But now the dream was shattered. The battle was no longer about who she knew or how much influence she could wield. It was about whether or not she would be held accountable for Greg's death. As the days passed and the trial loomed closer, Linda's defense team began to explore other options. They knew the evidence stacked against her was substantial, and the prospect of losing the case was becoming all too real. They began to discuss a plea bargain. The idea was one of the toughest pills Linda had ever had to swallow. She had spent so many years fighting to maintain control, to prove her innocence, and now she was facing the reality that her only way out might be to admit guilt in exchange for a lighter sentence. In a private meeting with her lawyers, Linda's face was etched with uncertainty. "You're telling me that I might have to plead guilty? After everything we've been through?" Her lawyer leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "Linda, the circumstantial evidence is too much to ignore. You've got to understand that we're in a difficult position. A plea bargain could give us some leverage, maybe a reduced sentence. But if we go to trial and the jury finds you guilty, it could be much worse." Linda's eyes darted around the room, as if searching for a way out. "So what? I just give up?" Her lawyer sighed, his tone softening. "It's not about giving up. It's about making the best of a bad situation. You're facing a lot of time if this goes to trial. A plea deal might be the only way to move forward." The weight of the decision was unbearable. Linda had always believed that the truth, whatever it was, would eventually come to light, and she would be vindicated. But now, the choice before her wasn't about truth, it was about survival. As the trial date drew nearer, Linda's options grew slimmer. The once confident woman who had relied on her connections, her power, and her influence, was now standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether she could avoid the fall. Her legal team would soon have to make a critical decision, one that would determine her fate. By 2013, Linda had reached the age of 71, a woman who had once exuded confidence and control. But the years had not been kind to her. Alzheimer's had begun to erode her memories, and with it, her ability to hold onto the life she had built. The once sharp and calculating woman now found herself grappling with the confusion and frustration that came with the disease. It was in this fragile state that Linda made the decision that would close the chapter on her legal battle. Linda's defense team had been working tirelessly, exploring every avenue in an attempt to find a way out. But the mounting pressure, the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, and the relentless pursuit of justice had finally worn her down. In a final, heartbreaking moment, she agreed to a plea deal. She would admit guilt in exchange for a 6-month jail sentence and 10 years of probation. It wasn't the harsh punishment some expected, but it was a resolution, controversial though it was. Her lawyer, knowing the weight of her decision, sat across from her in the quiet office, his voice somber. "Linda, are you sure this is what you want? The plea deal is the best option we have, but it comes with consequences. The public will have a lot to say." Linda looked at him, her expression vacant at times, but there was a flicker of understanding. I don't want to go to trial. I can't fight this anymore. It's too much." The lawyer nodded slowly, understanding the toll that the years of legal battles had taken on her. "You understand, though, this isn't exactly a victory. Many will say you got off too easy." Linda, her hands trembling slightly, barely looked up as she spoke. "Let them say what they want. It doesn't matter anymore." The decision, while a relief to Linda in some ways, was not met with universal approval. In fact, for many, it felt like a slap in the face. The murder of Greg had haunted so many for years, and now it seemed the woman responsible would not face the full consequences of her actions. 6 months in jail, a mere blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things, seemed far too lenient, especially for someone who had lived a life filled with privilege and connections. But not everyone felt that way. Pam Nally, Greg's daughter, had carried the burden of her father's death for so long. Her emotions were complicated. On one hand, she wished Linda could face a harsher sentence. On the other, there was a sense of peace in knowing that Linda had finally admitted to what she had done. In an interview shortly after the plea deal was announced, Pam said, her voice steady but filled with years of pent-up pain, "She is willingly admitting that she murdered him, and that's something we've known all these years. It may not be the justice we expected, but it's something. It's a step toward healing." For Pam, the admission of guilt, even if it came with a light sentence, offered some sense of closure. The long silence, the unanswered questions, had haunted her family for far too long. Now there was a finality to it all. Linda had confessed, and although it wasn't the outcome Pam had hoped for, there was solace in the truth being revealed, even if only in part. As Linda faced the consequences of her actions, her Alzheimer's added a layer of complexity to the case. Was she truly aware of what she was admitting to? How much of her memory had been lost in the haze of the disease? Many questioned whether she could fully comprehend the weight of her confession. But in the end, the court accepted the plea deal, and Linda was sentenced to 6 months in jail. A mere 6 months in exchange for the life of a man, Greg, who had once been loved, now gone forever. The resolution, though controversial, brought a kind of closure. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served, but it left behind a trail of questions and mixed emotions. Was this enough for the victims' families? Could a confession, no matter how late, ever truly heal the wounds caused by a tragic loss? Only time would tell, but for now Linda's story had come to its unsettling conclusion.